Ukraine is closer than ever to joining the European Union, and if that happens, it would be Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare. Because the EU isn't just another political club, it's the centerpiece of the biggest power project in modern Europe, the long struggle for European unification. EU membership would change everything in Ukraine. The economy, borders, alliances, and even its security future. It would be the final, irreversible break with Russia, the outcome that Putin fears the most. It's the very future Putin launched a war of aggression to stop. But now Ukraine is drifting further away from Moscow than ever, and closer to Brussels. To understand why EU membership matters so much for Ukraine today, and why the Kremlin is fighting so intensely to stop it, we have to go back to a time when Europe looked completely different. During the Cold War, the continent was divided between two competing systems. Western Europe built market economies, democratic institutions, and a culture of cooperation. Eastern Europe remained under Soviet control, where the state dictated political life and economic activity. Ukraine was not simply part of the Eastern Bloc, it was one of the Soviet republics, which meant its political and economic direction was set in Moscow. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the entire region changed overnight. Ukraine gained independence, but independence arrived with deep economic shocks, weak state institutions, and rising corruption. Meanwhile, countries to Ukraine's west moved quickly in another direction. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the Baltic states began opening their markets, strengthening their legal systems, and preparing for EU membership. They wanted stability and access to larger economic community that could help them modernize. Over the next decades, their economies grew stronger, their infrastructure improved, and their democratic institutions became simply more democratic. This contrast matters because it shows why Ukraine looked west early on, and why Russia viewed that shift as a threat to its influence. Before going deeper into that history, it helps to understand what the European Union actually is. For many people, the EU feels abstract, almost like a distant bureaucracy. In reality, it began as a very practical idea. After the Second World War, European governments wanted to prevent another conflict. The solution was cooperation on essential industries like coal and steel. If countries depended on one another, war was less likely. Over time, this cooperation expanded into a single market, where goods, services, people, and capital can move freely across borders. Member states agreed on shared legal standards, consumer protections, and environmental rules. They built institutions like the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the European Court of Justice to keep the system fair and stable. The EU offers access to the world's largest single market, strong legal protections, and educational opportunities across borders. When former communist states in Central and Eastern Europe joined the EU, their economies accelerated, investments poured in, and citizens experienced levels of mobility and opportunity that had been impossible under Soviet rule. Ukraine watched all of this happen next door. It saw Poland become a high-growth economy, Estonia turned into a digital powerhouse, and Lithuania modernized far faster than anyone could have predicted. For many Ukrainians, especially the younger generations, these neighbor states proved what was possible if a country embraced reforms and joined Europe's institutional framework. But Ukraine's path was more complicated. It faced corruption that had seeped into every major sector. Oligarchs took control of key industries and built networks inside parliament and ministries. Governments changed constantly, often fighting more with each other than with the problems they were elected to fix. And above everything, there was Russia, which was determined not to let Ukraine drift too far from Moscow's orbit. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, Russia used the leverage it had. Ukraine relied heavily on Russian gas, and every winter reminded the country of that fact. Discounts appeared when Kyiv leaned towards Moscow. Prices rose when leaders spoke too warmly about the EU. Trade restrictions hit Ukrainian factories when politicians in Kyiv explored deep integration with Brussels. These moves were subtle at times, but the message was clear. Russia expected Ukraine to stay close. Even so, the idea of joining Europe never disappeared. Ukrainian students studied abroad. Young professionals compared salaries and opportunities with friends in Poland or Latvia. And civil society organizations pushed for transparency and rule of law. The momentum built slowly, driven by people who believed Ukraine deserved the same future as its neighbors. The first major confrontation came in 2004. A presidential election widely seen as rigged sparked mass protests in Kyiv. People stood in freezing temperatures, demanding a fair vote and a government that reflected their choices. This moment became known as the Orange Revolution. It was the first time the world saw Ukrainians come out in huge numbers to defend their right to choose their own direction. A new election was organized, and a pro-European candidate won. But revolutions don't solve everything. Over the next few years, internal divisions returned. Corruption persisted. The economy stumbled. Moscow used gas and trade pressure once again, reminding Ukraine that independence came with a cost. As domestic frustrations grew, Russia regained influence. By the time Viktor Yanukovych became president in 2010, Ukraine was drifting back towards Moscow's orbit. He promised a balanced relationship with Europe, but his policies leaned heavily towards Russia. But the EU still tried to bring Ukraine closer. Brussels negotiated a major association agreement that would modernize Ukraine's economy and open the door for deeper cooperation. Now, it wasn't full membership, but it was a serious step towards the European system that Ukraine's neighbors had benefited from. Then came the breaking point in 2013. Days before the agreement was set to be signed, Yanukovych froze the process. Moscow wanted Ukraine in a Russian-led customs union instead, and the pressure behind the scenes was enormous. Ukrainians felt that their future had been bargained away. People began gathering in Kyiv's central square, waving European flags and calling for a different direction. The protests grew into what the world now calls the Euromaidan movement. The more the government tried to suppress the demonstrators, the larger the crowds became. Students, professionals, pensioners, and families all joined. For them, the issue wasn't just a treaty. It was about dignity, independence, and a future not controlled by another capital. After months of tension and deadly clashes, Yanukovych fled the country. A new government took over, one that openly embraced Ukraine's European choice. This was a complete shock for Moscow. Because for Russia, Ukraine joining the EU didn't just mean political integration. It meant losing influence over a country it always considered part of its sphere. As we mentioned earlier, Ukraine's membership in the EU meant Europe gaining a huge new partner on Russia's border. It meant a model that could inspire Russians themselves. Within weeks, Russia seized Crimea and supported separatists in eastern Ukraine. This annexation of Crimea broke the post-Cold War belief that borders in Europe were fixed. Russian troops moved in quickly, and within weeks, Moscow claimed the peninsula as its own. Many Ukrainians felt betrayed, not only because they lost their land, but because it showed that their neighbor, which had once called itself a brother nation, was willing to take whatever it wanted the moment Ukraine tried to choose a different path. As the news from Crimea settled, violence spread into eastern Ukraine, where Russia-backed groups seized towns across Donetsk and Luhansk. What began as hybrid warfare soon became a long, grinding conflict that would define the next 8 years. This period reshaped how Ukrainians viewed Europe and their own future. Before 2014, EU membership felt like a long-term goal, something to pursue gradually, while balancing relations with both East and West. After Russia's intervention, that mindset changed. Europe was no longer just about trade or visas. It became tied to safety, stability, and the ability to stand up to external pressure. Each clash in the Donbass, and every family forced from their home, pushed the country toward the same conclusion. It needed to anchor itself in a system based on clear rules, rather than drift back into Moscow's shadow. The invasion also rewired domestic politics. Old divisions between pro-European and pro-Russian blocs lost their meaning. Many voters who once preferred closer ties with Moscow reconsidered their position. Volunteers from largely Russian-speaking areas joined the defense effort, showing that loyalty to the state ran deeper than language. Families with personal connections on both sides of the border watched propaganda tear apart relationships that had lasted generations. The long-promoted idea of a common Slavic space began to crumble, replaced by a stronger sense of identity rooted in citizenship, shared experience, and the determination to chart an independent path. With that in mind, the Minsk agreements, signed in 2014 and 2015, were supposed to stop the fighting in the east. They called for ceasefires, troop withdrawals, and local elections in separatist-held areas. The agreements were fragile from the start. Russia insisted it was not a party of the conflict, even while supplying fighters and weapons. Ceasefires collapsed again and again. Front lines remained active. Civilians suffered. And while diplomats argued over wording, soldiers on the ground faced daily attacks. While fighting continued in the east, Ukraine tried to rebuild the state from within. The economy had been damaged by the revolution, and now war added another layer of strain. Banks collapsed, the currency lost value, and industries in the east, factories, coal mines, power plants, were suddenly cut off. The government had to turn to the IMF and the EU for emergency support. In return, Ukraine agreed to major reforms, many of which were long overdue. These reforms were difficult, sometimes painful, but they began changing the country in ways that Moscow did not expect. One of the most important changes was the creation of anti-corruption bodies. Because for years, corruption had been one of the biggest obstacles blocking Ukraine's progress. Western partners pushed for new institutions, independent prosecutors, and public oversight systems. These were not quick fixes. Old networks still resisted change. But for the first time, Ukraine had legal and political tools to challenge the oligarch-dominated system that had held it back since independence. Still, even in this uncertainty, Ukraine continued inching closer to Europe. The EU granted visa-free travel in 2017, a major symbolic and practical milestone. Ukrainian passports suddenly opened doors across the continent. And Petro Poroshenko, the president who came to power after the Euromaidan, pushed reforms but faced criticism that he moved too slowly. Frustration grew, especially among younger voters who wanted quicker progress and clearer governance. In 2019, Ukrainians elected Volodymyr Zelensky, a former comedian who promised to break with the past. He campaigned on unity, renewal, and a simple message: corruption should no longer decide the country's future. Zelensky entered office with huge public support and a clear mandate to modernize the state. He pushed through new reforms and tried to revive the stalled peace process with Russia. The hope was that diplomacy could end the war in the Donbass. However, it soon became clear that the conflict could not be solved with handshakes or optimistic speeches. Russia kept troops at the border. Militias in the east continued to receive weapons. Every attempt to restart talks ran into the same wall. Moscow still expected Ukraine to accept a political deal that would leave Russia with influence over Ukraine's decisions. The idea of Ukraine moving closer to the EU and NATO challenged everything Moscow claimed about its right to influence the region. The Kremlin saw this not as a neighbor's choice, but as a direct threat. When Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border in February of 2022, the world watched a turning point unfold in real time. For Ukrainians, the invasion did not feel like the start of a new conflict, but the collapse of the last illusion that Russia could ever accept their independence. What began in Crimea in 2014 had now expanded into a full attempt to break the country completely. Entire cities woke up to explosions. Families grabbed whatever they could carry. Roads filled with cars stretching for kilometers as people tried to flee towards the west. For many Ukrainians, the fear was not only the destruction itself, but the possibility that the country's future could be erased in a matter of days. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing, Ukraine held its ground. Soldiers fought with determination, and volunteers helped defend towns. Civilians organized supplies, built barricades, and took in those who had lost their homes. The country's sense of identity, strengthened by years of crisis and reform, turned into a powerful force. Ukraine showed that it was not just a state on the map, but a nation ready to protect its place in Europe. As the fighting intensified, an equally important battle unfolded on the diplomatic front. Kyiv made the case that Ukraine was defending more than its own borders. It argued that it was shielding Europe from aggression that could spread far wider if left unanswered. EU leaders who had spent years debating slow-paced reforms suddenly found themselves making fast, historic decisions. Within days, Ukraine formally applied for EU membership, and within a few months, the EU granted Ukraine candidate status. People who had grown up believing that the EU was a distant, unreachable goal now saw the possibility of joining as something real and urgent. This was not charity or symbolism. It was Europe recognizing that Ukraine's future was closely tied to its own. Inside Ukraine, the war forced the government to accelerate changes that had been promised for years. Institutions needed to function under pressure. Corruption networks had to be dismantled because every stolen euro meant fewer weapons, fewer shelters, and fewer lives saved. Parliament pushed through new laws on public procurement, judicial reform, and transparency. Anti-corruption bodies gained more power. Civil society groups worked alongside the government to monitor wartime spending. Even as missiles hit cities and towns, the country kept writing legislation, reviewing appointments, improving oversight, and aligning standards with the EU. Few countries in Europe have reformed under conditions as difficult as these, and it showed how serious Ukraine was about joining the Union. The war in Ukraine also raised a very important, long-due question. Energy dependence on Russia had long been treated as an uncomfortable but manageable problem. But once the invasion began, EU members understood that relying on Moscow for gas and oil was no longer just risky but dangerous. Decisions that had once taken years were now agreed upon in weeks. Sanctions packages rolled out, one after another. Russian banks were cut off, trade was restricted, and assets were frozen. European companies pulled out of Russia. Supply chains were rebuilt. The EU began coordinating weapons deliveries, something unthinkable only a few years earlier. Ukraine's struggle forced Europe to rethink what solidarity meant in practice. It also made clear that enlargement was not a formality but a strategic necessity. Ukraine, meanwhile, used again every moment to push closer to Europe. Its diplomats worked nonstop. Its president spoke in dozens of parliaments. Citizens raised their voices online and in rallies across Europe. The message was simple. Ukraine was defending the same values that the EU was built upon. And if those values meant anything, Europe had to support Ukraine fully. Over time, this view spread across the continent. Public opinion shifted. Countries that were once cautious about enlargement began to see Ukraine not as a burden, but as a partner whose success would strengthen the entire region. As the war stretched into 2024, the EU deepened its support. Funding packages worth billions were approved. Energy assistance, reconstruction plans, and military aid became part of regular EU business. New programs prepared Ukraine for the single market. Screening processes for EU clusters advanced. By 2025, the European Commission recognized that Ukraine had made significant progress on reforms, even in wartime. It signaled that negotiations could open fully once the remaining conditions were met. Despite the war, Ukraine had advanced quickly. Ukraine aligned its laws with European norms. Brussels, recognizing the geopolitical stakes, has treated enlargement as a security priority and prepared for a future with new members. If Ukraine succeeds, it will show that post-Soviet society can reform, integrate with the West, and choose its own path. And that possibility is what Putin's regime in Russia fears the most. That's because if Ukraine were to join the European Union, the impact on its economy and daily life would be enormous. Membership is not just a political symbol. It unlocks access to the world's largest single market, which allows goods, services, capital, and people to move freely across borders. For Ukraine, this means its products could enter a market of more than 450 million consumers, without tariffs or complicated barriers. When other Eastern European countries joined the EU in 2004, their exports to Europe doubled within only a few years. Foreign investment also surged. Poland, for example, saw over 200 billion euros in EU-linked investments between 2004 and 2020, and its GDP per capita more than tripled. Similar trends appeared across the Baltic states, where wages rose, unemployment dropped, and new industries took root. That same kind of transformation is possible for Ukraine. Studies from European financial institutions estimate that Ukraine's GDP could grow by an additional 5 to 7% per year during the first decade after accession. This growth could come from modernizing agriculture, rebuilding infrastructure with EU funds, and allowing Ukrainian companies to compete on equal footing in European markets. Farmers would gain access to newer technology and stable pricing systems. Factories could partner with European firms, upgrading equipment and meeting higher standards. Young Ukrainians would benefit from educational and work mobility, giving them the same opportunities as students in Poland or Germany. Even small businesses would feel the change through clearer regulations, less corruption, and easier access to credit. Beyond economics, EU membership would formalize Ukraine's ties with its closest allies. It would anchor the country inside a community built on shared laws, coordinated policies, and joint decision-making. Ukraine would take part in EU security debates, trade negotiations, and long-term planning. It would join European institutions that protect judicial independence, consumer rights, and fair competition. This matters, because every step towards EU alignment reduces the space for political manipulation and raises the cost of external interference. The more Ukraine integrates, the harder it becomes for any outside power to pressure it through energy, trade, or political networks. In practical terms, EU membership would lock Ukraine into a predictable system of laws and obligations, making it harder for corruption to flourish and easier for businesses to plan for the future. So for Russia, the idea of Ukraine joining the European Union strikes at the heart of its influence in Eastern Europe. Moscow has long insisted that former Soviet republics remain within its orbit, using gas supplies, trade pressure, and political networks to keep them close. An EU-aligned Ukraine would break that system. It would reshape the region's security map, weaken Russia's leverage, and place a large, reforming democracy directly on its border. The Kremlin sees the EU not only as a market, but as a force that pulls states towards transparency, rule of law, and political openness. When countries integrate, corruption decreases, investment rises, and Russia's pressure tools lose their effect. Instability around Ukraine serves Moscow's interests because conflict slows reforms, discourages investors, and complicates Ukraine's ability to meet EU standards.